Welcome to another deep dive, everyone. Today we're going to try to wrap our heads around a really fascinating but admittedly dense 14th century thinker you might not have heard of, Peter Auriol.
His ideas are super influential, though. You can see their echoes in later philosophers like Gregory of Rimini, and there's even a chance he had an impact on Martin Luther.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. So we're talking about someone who really shook things up, huh?
Oh, yeah. Buckle up, because Auriol will definitely challenge a modern philosopher's worldview.
Sounds fun. So where do we even start with a guy like this?
Well, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy has a great entry on Auriol. That's our main source for this deep dive.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, so to kick things off, can you give us a little taste of what makes Auriol so radical? What are we getting ourselves into here?
One of the big things you need to understand about Auriol is this idea of esse apparens, which is basically that when we perceive something, or even just think about it, it takes on a kind of special existence in our minds.
So it's not just about how things are out there in the world, but how they appear to us in the act of thinking or perceiving.
Exactly. And what's wild is that Auriol applies this not just to, sensory perception, but to intellectual concepts, too.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Think about those optical illusions where a stick looks bent when it's in water.
Yeah, I've seen those.
Auriol would say that it's not just our eyes being tricked, it's that the stick actually is bent, but only in a certain way.
Like it exists as bent in our perception.
Right. It has this apparent existence, but it's still a kind of existence. And he takes this idea and runs with it to explain all sorts of things about how our minds work.
Okay, my mind is already starting to bend a little bit, but before we go too far down that rabbit hole, let's take a step back and get to know Auriol himself a bit. You mentioned he was a 14th century thinker, right?
Yeah, he was born around 1280 and actually died pretty young, became an archbishop, but still managed to write a ton.
He sounds like a busy guy.
Yeah.
Was he mostly focused on theology then?
Most of his works are theological, but his philosophical chops are seriously sharp. He was always coming up with these systematic ways of thinking about things, and he was constantly engaging with other big thinkers like Duns Scotus and Thomas Aquinas.
So he wasn't afraid to go toe-to-toe with the philosophical heavyweights.
Not at all. He often flat out disagreed with them, sometimes in pretty radical ways. For example, he argued that only 5 of the 10 Aristotelian categories actually exist in the real world.
Whoa, okay, so we've got a rebel on our hands.
Yeah.
So what were some of the other key ideas that made Auriol stand out?
One of the biggest things is his commitment to conceptualism, which is this idea that only individual things really exist.
So like, this table exists, and that chair exists, but tableness and chairness as general concepts don't.
Exactly. Those universals, as philosophers call them, are just mental constructs for Auriol.
I can see how that would shake things up philosophically. But if universals don't exist, how do we even form those concepts in the first place?
Auriol says we do it through these things called rations. Basically, each individual thing has its own unique set of characteristics.
So like every table has its own specific size, shape, material, and so on.
Right. And those individual characteristics, those rations, are what our minds pick up on when we form a general concept. So like Socrates and Plato both have this characteristic of being human, but it's not that they share some identical universal humanity. It's that they have these maximally similar rations that our minds recognize and use to build the concept of human.
It's like our minds are taking these little snapshots of individual features and then piecing them together to create a bigger picture.
That's a good way to think about it. And it all comes back to Auriol's idea that everything starts with individual things and their unique properties rather than these abstract universal forms floating around out there.
This is all starting to make sense, but I have a feeling we're just scratching the surface here.
Oh, definitely. Auriol's conceptualism has a ton of implications for how he understands knowledge, perception, and even the nature of reality itself.
All right, so Auriol's conceptualism is pretty wild.
Yeah.
It seems like it ties in with his idea as acarensis, right? Like if everything starts with those singular things and their rations, it's our perception and thinking that brings them into this special kind of existence.
Yeah, definitely. You're picking up on how Auriol's ideas all kind of weave together into this really intricate system. His conceptualism isn't just about what exists. It's also about how we know and understand the world.
So it's about how we get from those individual things to those bigger concepts. And speaking of how we know things, Auriol talks a lot about intuitive and abstractive cognition, doesn't he? That's a distinction that Duns Scotus made, right?
Exactly. Scotus said intuitive cognition is about those things that are right there in front of you, actually existing, while abstractive cognition is for things that aren't directly present. You have to use your mind to sort of bridge the gap.
So like seeing a tree versus remembering what a tree looks like.
Yeah, something like that. But Auriol takes this distinction and kind of flips it on its head.
Oh, how so?
Well, for Auriol, it's not so much about whether the object is physically there or not. It's more about the quality of the experience, how it's presented to your awareness. He uses this example of like seeing a star in the night sky versus imagining that same star.
I think I see what you mean. When you're actually seeing the star, there's this sense of immediacy, of direct contact. But when you imagine it, even if you can picture it really clearly in your mind, it doesn't feel quite the same.
Exactly. That feeling, that character of the experience, that's the key difference between intuitive and abstractive cognition for Auriol. He actually lays out 4 specific characteristics of intuitive cognition.
4, what are they?
They're immediacy, presentness, actualization, and existence.
Okay, break that down for me. Immediacy, I get that.
Yeah.
No middleman, you're just right there with the object. But what about presentness?
Presentness is about how vividly something shows up in your awareness. Like, even if it's not physically there, in intuitive cognition, the object just feels undeniably present. Think of dreams or hallucinations. You're experiencing things that aren't really there, but they feel so real in the moment.
It's like those optical illusions again. You know, the stick isn't actually bent, but it's presented to you as undeniably bent.
Right. And then you've got actualization and existence. In intuitive cognition, the object feels totally complete and real, even if it doesn't actually exist in reality. It's like your perception gives it this temporary existence, at least in your experience.
So is Auriel saying that our minds can basically make things real, even if they're not?
Well, it's more nuanced than that. For Auriol, all cognition involves this apparence, this apparent existence. But intuitive cognition just brings the object into a stronger, more vivid kind of appearance.
I see. It's all about degrees of how real something feels to us. So how does this all fit into Auriel's overall view of knowledge? What's the big picture here?
It gets really interesting when he talks about intuitive intellectual cognition.
What's that?
Well, remember, he says that in this life, humans can't have direct intuitive knowledge of anything because we're so reliant on our senses. So even when we encounter a singular object, our understanding of it is still kind of filtered through this abstractive process.
Wait, really? But our senses can have intuitive cognition, like with that star example.
Right.
Why can't our intellects do the same thing?
Auriol thinks it's because we're stuck with these physical bodies and senses. They get in the way, you know? He says that true intuitive intellectual cognition is for beings that aren't limited by those things, like angels or like the blessed in heaven.
So we're basically stuck in this world of interpretations and mental representations, never able to fully grasp the true essence of things.
In a way, yeah, he has a sort of skeptical streak there, but he doesn't think abstractive cognition is worthless. We can still achieve a lot through it, even if it's not the same as that direct, unmediated intuition.
So it's like, we may not be able to fly like birds, but we can still build airplanes and soar through the air.
Exactly. And this limitation on intuitive intellectual cognition has some big implications for what Auriol thinks human reason can achieve. Like, he says we can't actually prove certain things for sure, like the creation of the universe, because we lack that direct intuitive insight.
So it's not just about the quality of our knowledge, but the kinds of things we can actually know. Are there other areas where Auriel sees this limitation popping up?
Yeah, definitely. And this is where things get even more interesting because his ideas about how we form concepts of individual things really tie into all this. Even understanding those singular things for Auriol involves this level of abstraction and mediation that keeps us from truly grasping their essence.
Wow, okay, this is heavy stuff. I think we need a minute to process all of this before we dive into the specifics of how Auriel thinks we conceptualize those individual things. All right, I think I've caught my breath. So we left off talking about how Auriel thinks we can't have this direct, intuitive knowledge of anything because of those limitations from our senses.
Right. And that includes individual things, too. Even when we're talking about that singular object, like a specific tree, Auriol says our understanding is still shaped by this abstractive process.
So even when I look at a tree and think that's a tree and it's different from any other tree, I'm not really grasping its essence directly.
That's Auriol's point, yeah. He
Oh.
doesn't think we can have this pure, unfiltered intellectual grasp of that tree's individual essence. Instead, he has this whole theory about how our minds actually construct concepts of singular objects.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. How does that work? What's his theory?
Well, let's stick with that tree example. Imagine you're looking at a tree, your senses are taking in all these details.
Its size, shape, the texture of the bark.
Exactly. The color of the leaves, how the light shines through them, all of that sensory data comes flooding into your mind.
So it's like our senses are creating a snapshot of
Hmm.
all the things that make that tree unique.
That's a good way to put it. But that's only the first step. That raw sensory data doesn't actually give you the concept of the tree as a singular thing yet. That's where Auriol says our intellect comes into play.
Oh, so our intellect takes those snapshots and does something more with them.
Exactly. Auriol says the intellect recognizes that all those senses are focused on one object at that moment, and it makes a kind of logical jump.
A jump. To what?
It reasons that there must be one single individual thing present and that it's distinct from everything else.
So it's like step one, the senses gather up all the unique features. And then step two, the intellect steps in and says, okay, based on all this information, there must be one individual thing causing all of this. And that's what I'm seeing.
You got it. And this whole process for Auriol, it's all abstractive. You're not directly intuitively grasping the tree's essence. You're constructing it intellectually based on that sensory data and reasoning.
It's like we're building a concept of the tree in our minds,
Mm.
piece by piece.
Exactly. So even when we're talking about these singular objects, our knowledge of them, for Auriol, is always mediated. It's shaped by our thought processes. We're not experiencing that tree directly, but rather our concept of it, our mental representation.
Hmm. That makes me wonder if our understanding is always going through this filter, so to speak. Can we ever really truly know an individual object? Like, are we always kept at arm's length from the real essence of things?
That's a big question, and it gets to the heart of Auriol's skepticism about what we can actually know in this life. Remember, he says that true intuitive intellectual cognition is beyond our reach because we're so tied to our bodies and senses.
So we're always looking at the world through these cognitive lenses, even when we're focused on individual things.
Yeah, we can try to understand things as best we can, gather all the sensory information, use our reasoning to refine those concepts, but there's always going to be this gap between our understanding and the object itself.
Auriel seems to suggest that we need to wait for the afterlife to bridge that gap when our souls are free from those limitations.
Right. He says that angels and the blessed in heaven, because they're purely intellectual beings, they would have that direct, intuitive knowledge that we lack.
So they get the full high-definition experience of reality, and we're stuck with standard def.
Well, it's a bit more complicated than that, but I think you get the idea.
I do. It's a bit humbling. But also, honestly, kind of inspiring. It makes you realize how much there is to explore when it comes to how we know things.
It really does. And that's the beauty of philosophy. Thinkers like Auriol, they push us to question our assumptions, consider new possibilities, and appreciate just how amazing our minds really are, even with their limitations.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, that was quite a journey through Auriel's thought. I'm definitely going to be thinking about all of this for a while. And to our listeners, I hope you'll join us next time for another deep dive into the world of ideas. Until then, keep those philosophical wheels turning.